My husband's secretary sent me their vacation photos from Cabo, bikinis, champagne, and passionate kisses on the beach. 2 hours later, I sent them both pink slips and security escorts. This is impossible, my husband stammered, staring at the termination letters. You're just middle management. That's when I smiled and said, check the company directory again, darling. You'll find my real title quite illuminating. The rain hammered against the windows of Sterling Dynamics' 32nd floor, as I sat in what everyone believed was just another routine Monday meeting. The mahogany conference table stretched between us like a battlefield. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. And on the other side sat my husband of 12 years, Marcus Rivera, flanked by his secretary-turned-accomplice, Natasha Chen. We need to discuss your performance, Claire, Marcus said, his voice carrying that cold, executive tone I'd grown to despise. Gone was any trace of the man who used to bring me coffee in bed, who'd once promised we'd build an empire together. Now he looked at me like I was just another line item, to be eliminated from his quarterly budget. Natasha leaned forward, her perfectly manicured fingers sliding a manila folder across the polished surface. Her red lips curved into what she probably thought was a sympathetic smile, but I could see the triumph dancing in her dark eyes. Claire, honey, she purred, her voice dripping with false concern. These restructuring decisions are never easy, but Sterling Dynamics is evolving. We need team members who can keep pace with our elevated standards. I didn't touch the folder. Instead, I studied their faces. Marcus with his designer suit, that cost more than most people's monthly salary, his hair perfectly styled to hide the growing bald spot he was sensitive about. Natasha, 28 to my 35, wearing a dress that probably violated half the items in our employee handbook, her engagement ring catching the fluorescent light. Yes, engagement ring. That detail still stung, even though I'd been expecting it. Elevated standards, I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air. That's an interesting phrase coming from someone who was sending me vacation photos just this morning. The color drained from Natasha's face, but Marcus remained stone-faced. He'd always been good at compartmentalizing, at separating his professional mask from whatever scraps of humanity he had left. I'm not sure what you're implying, Natasha said, but her voice had lost its confident edge. Her hand instinctively moved to her phone, as if she could somehow unsend the messages that had arrived in my inbox at 9:47 a.m. The photos had been stunning, I had to admit. Cabo San Lucas at sunset, waves crashing against golden sand. Marcus and Natasha intertwined on beach chairs, sharing champagne and what they clearly thought were secret moments. The final photo, a close-up of Natasha's hand wearing that new diamond ring, with Marcus's lips pressed against her neck, had been accompanied by a message that read, "Thought you should know how amazing your husband's surprise proposal was. Some women just deserve better, rather. Let me refresh your memory," I said, pulling out my phone and scrolling to the message. This morning at 9:47, you sent me 17 photos from your romantic getaway. The message said, and I quote, "Thought you should know how amazing your husband's surprise proposal was. Some women just deserve better." Marcus's composure finally cracked, his jaw tightened, and I saw his hands clench into fists on the table. "Natasha, what the hell? It was a mistake," she blurted out, panic creeping into her voice. "I meant to send those to my sister. The contacts got mixed up. Your sister's name is Rebecca," I said calmly. "My name is Claire. Hard to confuse a kiss with an R, don't you think? Especially when my contact in your phone is listed as Marcus's wife, which I know because you've pocket-dialed me twice during your intimate moments." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into his ergonomic chair, while Natasha's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the blotchy red patches spreading across her neck. "Look, Claire," Marcus finally said, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "Personal matters aside, this meeting is about business. Your position as Regional Operations Coordinator is being eliminated. The severance package is generous, 6 months' salary, continued benefits, excellent references. We're trying to make this as painless as possible." "Painless," I echoed, tasting the irony. "How thoughtful of you both." Natasha had recovered enough to slide the folder closer to me. The paperwork is all standard, she said, her professional mask sliding back into place. Just sign where the yellow tabs indicate, and you can have your personal items packed and be out by end of business today. Security will assist with the transition. I looked down at the folder but didn't open it. Instead, I pulled out my own phone and began typing. The soft clicking of my nails against the screen seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "What are you doing?" Marcus asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. "Oh, just sending a quick message," I replied without looking up. "You know how it is, keeping people informed about transitions." My phone buzzed almost immediately with responses. Then again, and again. Within 30 seconds it was vibrating continuously with incoming messages and calls. Marcus's phone buzzed next, then Natasha's. Their confident expressions began to shift as they read their screens, confusion replacing arrogance. "I don't understand," Natasha whispered, staring at her phone. "Security is asking me to report to the main desk immediately. There must be some mistake." Marcus's phone rang, the ringtone echoing off the conference room walls. The name on the screen made him go pale. "William Sterling, CEO. "Aren't you going to answer that?" I asked sweetly. With trembling fingers, Marcus accepted the call. "Mr. Sterling, good morning." Even from across the table I could hear the CEO's voice, crisp and furious. "Rivera, what the hell do you think you're doing firing my chief operating officer without authorization?" The phone slipped from Marcus's hand, clattering onto the table. He stared at me with the same expression I imagine people have when they realize they've been standing on the edge of a cliff all along. "Chief Operating Officer," Natasha whispered, her face now completely white. I stood up, smoothing my navy blazer. The same blazer I'd worn to every routine meeting, every status update, every moment when they'd treated me like I was just another mid-level employee who could be pushed around and discarded. "Check the company directory," I said, gathering my things. "You'll find it quite illuminating." As I walked toward the door, I could hear Marcus frantically typing on his phone, no doubt accessing the internal company database that he should have checked before planning his little coup. "This is impossible," he stammered. "You've been regional operations coordinator for 5 years. I've seen your business cards, your email signature." I paused at the door, my hand on the handle. "Marcus, darling, you've seen exactly what I wanted you to see. Did you really think William Sterling would leave his $30 billion company vulnerable by not having someone he trusted keeping an eye on operations? Someone who could move freely through every department, observe every decision, report directly to him without anyone suspecting." The realization hit them both like a physical blow. Natasha actually gripped the edge of the table, as if she might fall over. "Those business cards?" I continued. "The email signature, the modest office on the 15th floor, all part of what we call executive camouflage. It's amazing what people will say and do when they think you're beneath them." Marcus's phone was buzzing again. This time the name on the screen read, "Legal Department, UR Gent." "I'd answer that if I were you," I said. "I imagine they have some questions about the 17 photos your fiancé sent to a senior executive, detailing your extramarital relationship. Not to mention the unauthorized termination attempt of a C-suite officer. HR gets very cranky about things like that." I opened the door, and they could see the security team waiting in the hallway. "Not for me but for them. The severance packages I've prepared for both of you are actually quite generous," I said. "Consider it a wedding gift. You'll have plenty of time to plan your future together, elsewhere." As the door closed behind me, I could hear Natasha crying and Marcus frantically trying to call someone, anyone, who might be able to fix the unfixable mess they'd created. But there was no fixing this. They'd played their hand, and I'd been waiting 12 years to play mine. But let me take you back to that morning, just 4 hours earlier, when my entire world shifted with a single notification chime. I was sitting in my modest 15th floor office, the one Marcus and everyone else assumed belonged to a mid-level coordinator, reviewing quarterly performance reports that would later determine their fates. The Sterling Dynamics building hummed with its usual Monday morning energy. Outside my window, Seattle's skyline stretched toward Elliott Bay, the morning fog just beginning to lift. I'd chosen this office specifically. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Because it was unremarkable, tucked away in a corridor most executives never visited. The perfect observation post. My phone buzzed against the mahogany desk, the same desk Marcus had helped me pick out when I'd gotten the promotion to Regional Operations Coordinator 5 years ago. He'd been so proud, taking me to dinner to celebrate my step up in the company. If only he'd known he was celebrating my masterpiece of strategic deception. The notification showed Natasha's name, which was unusual. In the 3 years since Marcus had hired her as his executive assistant, she'd only contacted me directly twice, once for my birthday with a generic corporate message, and once to ask if I knew Marcus's coffee preference for a client meeting. I swiped to open the message, expecting some mundane request, or perhaps a scheduling conflict about Marcus's travel itinerary. Instead, my screen filled with images that made my blood run cold and my heart race simultaneously. Photo 1, Marcus and Natasha, on what was clearly a luxury resort balcony, him shirtless, her in a barely there bikini, both holding champagne flutes with the azure waters of Cabo San Lucas sparkling behind them. Photo 2, the same balcony at sunset, Natasha straddling Marcus on a lounge chair, her head thrown back in laughter while his hands gripped her waist possessively. Photo 3, a close-up of their hands intertwined on a restaurant table, Marcus's wedding ring notably absent, while Natasha wore a stunning 3-carat diamond engagement ring I'd never seen before. Photo 4, Marcus on one knee on the beach, Natasha's hands covering her mouth in apparent surprise, the engagement ring box open between them. The photos kept coming, 17 in total, each one a dagger to whatever remained of my heart, each one a piece of evidence I hadn't known I needed. But it was the message that accompanied them that transformed my shock into something far more dangerous. Thought you should know how amazing your husband's surprise proposal was. Some women just deserve better. I read it 3 times, my mind struggling to process the deliberate cruelty. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a pocket dial or wrong contact. This was calculated, intentional humiliation from a woman who believed she'd already won. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down, but not from heartbreak. The shaking came from a different emotion entirely, the cold, precise fury of someone who'd been underestimated for the last time. I walked to my office window, looking down at the parking garage where Marcus's Tesla was parked in his designated spot. He'd left for his business trip to San Diego 3 days ago, kissing me goodbye at our front door, promising to bring me back something special from the coast. Apparently he'd brought back an engagement to another woman instead. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 12 years of marriage, I'd been playing a role, the supportive wife, the competent but unremarkable employee, the woman who knew her place in both the corporate hierarchy and Marcus's life. And I'd played it perfectly, so perfectly, that even my own husband had no idea who he'd actually married. I returned to my desk and opened my laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard as I accessed systems that Marcus didn't even know existed. As Chief Operating Officer, I had visibility into every department, every expense report, every personnel file. It was time to see just how deep this betrayal ran. The first red flag appeared immediately in the travel expenses. Marcus's business trip to San Diego had been paid for with company funds, charged to the client development budget. Except there were no client meetings scheduled, no business justification filed, no approval from his supposed superior, who ironically, was me. A few more keystrokes revealed that Natasha had taken personal leave for the same 3 days, but her airline ticket to Cabo had been purchased using the company's preferred vendor account. More searching showed dinner charges at Nobu Los Cabos, spa treatments at the Montage, even a helicopter tour, all charged to Sterling Dynamics corporate credit card. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Natasha. Hope you're not too upset, sweetie. Marcus said you'd understand eventually. Some marriages just run their course. I screenshotted every message, every photo, adding them to a folder I was building on my secure drive. But I needed more than evidence of adultery and expense account fraud. I needed to understand the full scope of what they'd planned. A search through Marcus's email history, something I could access through the executive administrative override, revealed the truth in painful detail. The affair had been going on for 8 months, but more damaging were the email chains between Marcus and several other employees, including Natasha, discussing my upcoming departure from the company. Claire's gotten too comfortable, Marcus had written to his friend Jake in marketing. She thinks because she's married to me, her position is secure. Time to remind her how the real world works. Natasha had been even more explicit. Once Claire's gone, we can finally move forward with our plans. No more pretending to respect the boring little coordinator who thinks she matters. They'd been planning this termination for weeks, maybe months. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was professional, calculated, designed to destroy both my marriage and my career in one devastating blow. But they'd made one crucial error. They'd assumed I was actually the person I appeared to be. I picked up my desk phone and dialed a number I rarely used but always kept close. William Sterling's office. This is Patricia. Patricia, it's Claire. Is he available for a brief conversation? Of course, Miss Rivera. He's always available for you. Let me put you through. The line clicked, and William's familiar voice filled my ear. Claire, perfect timing. I was just reviewing the Q3 performance reports you sent over. Exceptional work as always. Thank you, William, but I'm calling about a different matter. I need to activate Protocol 7. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds. Protocol 7 was something we'd established years ago, but never used. The nuclear option for when my cover was blown, or my position was threatened. Are you certain? William asked, his tone shifting to deadly serious. Once we activate that protocol, there's no going back. I'm certain. Marcus and his secretary are attempting to terminate me this morning. They've been planning it for months while conducting an extramarital affair on company time and expense accounts. Jesus Christ, how did they find out who you really are? They didn't. They still think I'm just regional operations coordinator. That's what makes this so perfect. I could hear William's chair creaking as he leaned back, and I could picture him rubbing his temples the way he did when he was thinking through complex problems. Send me everything you have, he said finally. Photos, emails, expense reports, the works. How do you want to handle the reveal? I looked at my phone, at Natasha's smug messages, at the photos of my husband proposing to another woman with my marriage still legally intact. They've called a meeting for 10 a.m. to terminate me. I want to let them go through with it, let them think they've won. Then we drop the hammer. Claire, are you sure you want to handle it that way? We could stop this before. No, I interrupted. They need to feel exactly how it feels to believe they have all the power, only to discover they never had any at all. William was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, I could hear the approval in his voice. Sometimes I forget how ruthless you can be. It's terrifying and impressive in equal measure. I learned from the best, I replied. How long do you need to prepare? Give me 2 hours. By the time they walk into that conference room, everything will be in place. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, complete clarity. The woman who'd been playing regional operations coordinator was about to disappear forever. In her place would stand someone Marcus and Natasha had never actually met, the real Claire Rivera, Chief Operating Officer of Sterling Dynamics, and the architect of their professional destruction. I had 2 hours to prepare for the most satisfying meeting of my career. Those 2 hours between my call to William and the termination meeting were the longest and most revealing of my marriage. As I sat in my 15th floor office, systematically dismantling the illusion I'd lived in for months, each piece of evidence felt like another nail in the coffin of my relationship. I started with Marcus's email account, something I'd never violated before despite having administrative access. The first folder that caught my attention was labeled Personal Projects, a euphemism that made my stomach turn. The earliest message in the thread, dated back 11 months, long before I'd suspected anything was wrong. It was from Natasha to Marcus. Your presentation today was incredible. I've never seen someone command a room like that. You're wasted in your current position. Marcus's response made me wince. Thanks, Nat. It's nice to have someone who actually appreciates ambition. Some people are content with mediocrity. I knew he was talking about me. For months, I'd been encouraging him to focus on sustainable growth, rather than the flashy high-risk ventures he preferred. As his wife, I'd thought I was offering support. As his secret superior, I'd been trying to protect the company, he'd interpreted both as lack of ambition. The messages escalated quickly. Within 3 weeks, professional admiration had turned into personal conversations. Within 2 months, they were meeting for working dinners that lasted until midnight. By month 4, the pretense was completely gone. "I can't stop thinking about last night," Natasha had written after what Marcus's calendar showed as a client strategy meeting in Vancouver. "You make me feel like the woman I'm supposed to be, confident, desired, important." Marcus's reply was even worse. "You are important. More important than someone who gave up on her dreams years ago. Claire used to have fire, but now she's just safe, boring. You remind me what it feels like to be with someone who wants more from life." I had to stop reading and walk to the window, my hands shaking with rage. The irony was suffocating. While Marcus was falling for a woman he saw as ambitious and dynamic, he had no idea he was married to the person who actually controlled his professional fate. But the personal betrayal was only the beginning. As I dug deeper into their communications, I discovered they'd been planning my professional destruction almost as long as their affair had been going on. The problem, Marcus had written to Natasha 6 months ago, is that Claire's too embedded in the company culture. People like her, she's been here 5 years, has relationships throughout the organization. We need to be strategic about this. Natasha's response revealed a calculating mind I'd never suspected. "What if we start documenting performance issues? Nothing dramatic, just little things. Missed deadlines, communication problems, failure to adapt to new initiatives. Build a paper trail that justifies the termination." My blood ran cold as I realized what they'd been doing. For months, they'd been sabotaging my projects and then documenting the failures they'd caused. The delayed reports I'd been blamed for, Natasha had been intercepting my submissions and holding them for days before forwarding them. The communication issues with other departments, she'd been editing my messages to make them seem dismissive or unclear. But Marcus's next message revealed the true scope of their plan. "Once Claire's gone, we can restructure her entire division. I've got 3 guys from my MBA program who could take over her responsibilities for half the cost. We bring them in as consultants initially, then transition them to permanent positions once the dust settles." They weren't just planning to fire me, they were planning to dismantle everything I'd built in my 5 years of camouflaged leadership. The sustainability initiatives that had saved the company millions in environmental compliance costs. The employee development programs that had reduced turnover by 40%. The strategic partnerships I'd cultivated with vendors that had improved our profit margins across every division. I kept reading, each message adding another layer to their betrayal. Natasha had been feeding Marcus information about other employees, identifying who was loyal to me and who might be turned. She'd been monitoring my calendar, my meetings, even my conversations with other executives. "Claire's been spending a lot of time with Diana from legal," she'd written 2 months ago. "They had lunch 3 times last week. Should we be concerned?" Marcus's response showed his paranoia. "Diana's ambitious. She might be positioning herself for Claire's job. We should keep an eye on that relationship." They had no idea that Diana and I had been working on a comprehensive review of executive compensation packages, a project that would have revealed Marcus's inflated salary and questionable expense claims long before the Cabo trip. But it was the most recent email thread that truly broke my heart. It was from just last week, while I'd been at my grandmother's funeral in Portland. "Perfect timing with Claire being out of town," Marcus had written. "We can finalize the termination paperwork and schedule the meeting for Monday. By the time she gets back, everything will be in place." Natasha's response was gleeful. "I can't wait to see her face when she realizes it's over. She's been walking around like she owns the place for too long. Time for a reality check." Marcus's final message in the thread was the most damning. "After Monday we'll finally be free to build the life we want. New position for you, clear path for my advancement, and no more pretending to care about someone who never understood what I was capable of." They'd planned my termination for the day I returned from burying my grandmother. While I'd been grieving, they'd been celebrating their future together and my professional destruction. I printed every email, every message, every piece of evidence. But I needed more than their words. I needed to understand how deep their corruption went. A search through the company's financial systems revealed the truth I'd been dreading. The Cabo trip was just the tip of the iceberg. Over the past 8 months, Marcus had been systematically abusing his expense account privileges. Business dinners at Seattle's most expensive restaurants, always for 2 people, always on nights when I thought he was working late. Client entertainment charges for weekend trips to Victoria, wine tastings in Napa, even a weekend at a luxury resort in Whistler. Every romantic getaway I'd thought was too expensive for our personal budget had been funded by Sterling Dynamics. But the most egregious abuse was a charge from 2 months ago, $8,500 for executive team building at a jewelry store. The date matched perfectly with when Natasha had started wearing that engagement ring. Marcus had bought his mistress's engagement ring with company money. I was still processing that violation when my secure phone rang. William's direct line. "Claire, I've been reviewing the materials you sent. This is worse than corporate fraud. This is a systematic dismantling of your authority." "I know," I said quietly. "They've been planning this for months. Maybe longer." The legal team is furious. Not just about the expense violations, but about the attempted termination without board approval. As COO, your position requires board vote for any changes. Marcus doesn't have the authority to fire you even if you were the person he thinks you are. I laughed bitterly. He thinks he's firing a coordinator. He has no idea he's attempting a corporate coup. "Claire, I need to ask this directly. How do you want to handle the personal aspect? The affair, the engagement, the public humiliation they've inflicted." I looked at my computer screen, at the final email Marcus had sent to Natasha just this morning. "Today's the day, babe. By tonight, we'll be celebrating our freedom and Claire will be packing her boxes. Can't wait to start our real life together. I want them to feel exactly as powerless as they tried to make me feel," I said. "But I want it to be professional, legal, and absolutely devastating. Consider it done. By the time you walk into that conference room, their access cards will be deactivated, their expense accounts frozen, and security will be waiting. Legal is preparing termination papers citing fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and violation of company ethics policies. And Natasha? She's not an employee in the traditional sense, she's a contractor hired through Marcus's department. Her contract terminates immediately upon his termination. She'll be escorted out with him." I felt a grim satisfaction settling over me. "What about references? Future employment?" William's voice grew cold. "Companies tend to be very thorough when checking references for executives who've been terminated for fraud. I suspect they'll both find the job market quite challenging." After hanging up, I sat in my office for several more minutes, looking out at the Seattle skyline. In 90 minutes, I would walk into that conference room as Claire Rivera, Regional Operations Coordinator. I would leave as Claire Rivera, Chief Operating Officer, architect of the most justified corporate termination in Sterling Dynamics history. But first, I had one more email to send. I opened a new message to Marcus and Natasha, the subject line reading, "Meeting Confirmation, Monday 10 a.m. Looking forward to our discussion about my future with the company. I have several items to review that I think you'll find quite illuminating. See you both soon. Claire." I hit send, and began gathering the evidence files I'd prepared. In exactly 90 minutes, Marcus and Natasha would discover that underestimating someone is the most expensive mistake you can make in corporate America. They thought they were about to fire a coordinator. They were about to be destroyed by a chief operating officer. To understand how perfectly Marcus had walked into his own destruction, you need to know how I became the ghost in Sterling Dynamics' machine. The story began 7 years ago, not with ambition or corporate ladder climbing, but with a conversation that would reshape my entire life. I was working as a senior analyst at Morrison & Associates, a mid-tier consulting firm, where I'd spent 3 years after my MBA. The work was solid but uninspiring, helping companies optimize their supply chains and reduce operational costs. I was good at it, maybe even exceptional, but I felt like I was solving the same problems over and over again for clients who implemented half my recommendations and then wondered why they didn't see full results. Marcus and I had been married for 5 years then, and our relationship was entering that comfortable but concerning phase where we'd started living parallel lives. He worked 60-hour weeks at Sterling Dynamics, climbing from senior analyst to department manager with impressive speed. I admired his drive, but I was beginning to realize that Marcus measured success by the size of his office and the prestige of his title rather than the impact of his work. The turning point came during a dinner party at our friend's house in Bellevue. I was making small talk with a woman I'd just met when she mentioned she worked at Sterling Dynamics. "Oh, my husband works there too," I said. "Marcus Rivera, in strategic development." Her expression shifted slightly. "Marcus Rivera, yes, I know Marcus. He's very ambitious." Something in her tone made me probe deeper. "You don't sound convinced that's a good thing." She glanced around to make sure Marcus wasn't within earshot, then leaned closer. "Look, I probably shouldn't say this, but Marcus has a reputation for taking credit for other people's work. There was an incident last month where he presented a cost reduction strategy that was almost identical to something our operations team had proposed 6 months earlier. Word gets around in a company like Sterling." I felt my stomach drop, but I kept my expression neutral. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Similar problems, similar solutions. "Maybe," she said, but her skeptical look told me she didn't believe it any more than I did. That night, I lay awake thinking about Marcus's recent promotion and the glowing reviews he'd been getting from his superiors. I'd always been proud of his success, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't really know the man I'd married. At least not the professional version of him. Over the next few weeks I started paying more attention to Marcus's work stories. The brilliant insights he claimed to have during meetings, the innovative solutions he'd proposed that had impressed senior management, the strategic initiatives he'd spearheaded that were saving the company money. As someone who spent her days analyzing business processes, I began to notice patterns that troubled me. Marcus was ascending fast, too fast for someone who'd shown little strategic thinking during our years together. At home, he relied on me to balance our checkbook, plan our investments, even decide which insurance policies to buy. Yet at work, he was apparently a visionary leader capable of transforming entire business units. The truth revealed itself 3 months later when Marcus came home unusually excited about a presentation he'd given that day. "I absolutely nailed it," he said, loosening his tie and pouring himself a scotch. The entire executive team was blown away by my analysis of our vendor relationships. William Sterling himself said it was the most insightful presentation he'd seen all year. I smiled and congratulated him, but something nagged at me. The night before, I'd been working on a vendor analysis project for one of my own clients, a project that involved many of the same inefficiencies Marcus was describing. The solutions he was outlining were remarkably similar to recommendations I'd been developing. "That's amazing," I said carefully. "Can you walk me through your methodology? I'm working on something similar for Morrison, and I'd love to understand your approach." Marcus's enthusiasm faltered slightly. "Well, it's pretty technical, lot of proprietary analysis techniques. I'm not sure I can explain it in a way that would make sense for your smaller scale projects." But I pressed him, and within 10 minutes, it became clear that Marcus couldn't explain his own presentation because he hadn't actually developed the analysis. He was regurgitating concepts and frameworks he'd heard from others, mixing them with buzzwords he'd picked up in business magazines. That's when I realized Marcus wasn't rising through Sterling Dynamics because of his exceptional abilities. He was succeeding because he was exceptionally good at identifying valuable ideas and claiming them as his own. The discovery should have ended our marriage. Instead, it gave me an idea that would define the next 7 years of my life. 2 weeks later, I requested a meeting with William Sterling himself. Getting the appointment required some creative networking. I leveraged a connection from business school who worked in Sterling's legal department, but eventually, I found myself sitting across from one of Seattle's most respected CEOs. "Miss Rivera," he said, settling into his chair with the calm confidence of someone who'd built a company from the ground up. "Miranda mentioned you wanted to discuss some concerns about operational efficiency. I have to say, it's unusual for someone outside the company to request a meeting about our internal processes." "I appreciate you taking the time, Mr. Sterling. What I'm about to propose is going to sound unusual, but I think you'll find it valuable." I opened my briefcase and pulled out a comprehensive analysis I'd spent weeks preparing. I believe Sterling Dynamics has a significant vulnerability in your middle management layer. Specifically, you have people in positions of authority who are taking credit for work they didn't do, while the actual innovators remain unrecognized and underutilized. William's eyebrows rose slightly. That's a serious accusation. Do you have specific examples? I did. Over the past month, I'd done extensive research into Sterling Dynamics' recent strategic initiatives, cross-referencing them with industry publications, consulting reports, and even some discreet conversations with current and former employees. The pattern was undeniable. Many of the company's most celebrated recent innovations were actually recycled ideas from external sources or uncredited internal proposals. The vendor optimization strategy that was presented last month, I said, sliding a document across his desk. It's nearly identical to a framework published by McKinsey 18 months ago, with minor modifications to make it appear original. William studied the comparison I'd prepared, his expression growing more serious by the minute. The employee retention program that's being piloted in 3 departments, it's based on a Harvard Business Review case study from 2 years ago, the supply chain restructuring that's projected to save $2 million annually. That methodology was first proposed by your own operations team in 2019, but it was shelved when the department head left the company. I had 12 examples total, each one more damning than the last. By the time I finished my presentation, William was leaning back in his chair, his hands steepled in front of him. "This is troubling," he said finally. "But I'm curious why you're bringing this to me. What's your interest in Sterling Dynamics' internal politics?" This was the moment I'd been preparing for. "Because I think I can solve your problem, but it requires an unconventional approach. You need someone inside the company who can identify where the real innovations are coming from and ensure the right people get credit. Someone who can observe the actual decision-making processes without being influenced by office politics or personal relationships." "You're talking about corporate espionage," William said, but his tone was more intrigued than accusatory. "I'm talking about operational intelligence. You need to know what's really happening in your company, not just what gets filtered up through the management chain. I'm proposing to be your eyes and ears at the operational level." William was quiet for a long moment. "And how exactly would this work? You hire me as a mid-level coordinator. Something unremarkable, regional operations, process improvement, something that gives me access to multiple departments without drawing attention. I report directly to you on operational effectiveness, employee satisfaction, innovation sources, and management competency. Think of it as a long-term organizational audit, and in return, you get accurate information about how your company actually functions. You identify your real talent before your competitors poach them. You eliminate the inefficiencies that come from having the wrong people in leadership positions, and you protect yourself from the kind of strategic vulnerabilities that can destroy companies." William studied me for several minutes. "There's one obvious complication with this arrangement. Your husband works here." "That's not a complication," I said. "That's an advantage. Marcus will never suspect that his wife is anything more than what she appears to be. It's the perfect cover. You realize what you're proposing could destroy your marriage if he ever finds out." I thought about Marcus's excitement when he described stealing other people's work, his casual dismissal of the people whose ideas he'd appropriated, his growing arrogance as he climbed the corporate ladder on borrowed insights. "Mr. Sterling," I said, "I think my marriage might already be destroyed. I'm just the only one who knows it yet." 2 weeks later, I started at Sterling Dynamics as Regional Operations Coordinator, reporting directly to William Sterling through a private communication channel that appeared on no organizational chart. My official supervisor thought I was just another mid-level employee. My husband thought I'd taken a step down from consulting to have better work-life balance. Only William and I knew that I'd actually become the most powerful person in the company that no one had ever heard of. For 7 years I watched, listened, and reported. I saw Marcus continue his pattern of intellectual theft, growing bolder as his success mounted. I documented which employees were actually driving innovation, and which were simply good at presentations. I identified operational inefficiencies that were costing millions and recommended solutions that saved even more. And through it all I waited for the moment when Marcus would finally overreach, when his arrogance would make him attempt something so audacious that I could destroy him completely. That moment had finally arrived, gift wrapped in vacation photos from Cabo. What made my arrangement with William Sterling so devastatingly effective wasn't just the access it gave me, it was how completely invisible it made me to the people I was actually monitoring. For 7 years I'd perfected the art of being underestimated, and Marcus had become my unwitting masterpiece. The genius of the regional operations coordinator position was in its strategic ambiguity. To most employees I appeared to be exactly what my business cards claimed, a mid-level manager responsible for coordinating between departments and ensuring operational efficiency. Boring, administrative, forgettable. But that title gave me something more valuable than any executive suite: unlimited access without suspicion. I could attend meetings across every division, review financial reports from multiple departments, and ask detailed questions about processes and personnel without anyone wondering why I cared. After all, coordination requires understanding, and understanding requires information. The real brilliance, though, was in how William and I structured my reporting relationship. Officially, I reported to Jennifer Walsh, the Vice President of Operations, a competent but overwhelmed executive who was grateful to have someone handle the administrative details she didn't have time for. Jennifer genuinely believed she was my supervisor, and she treated me exactly like any other coordinator in her department. But hidden within Sterling Dynamics' corporate structure was a secondary reporting line that existed only in William's private files and a secure communication system that routed directly to his personal server. Every week I submitted 2 reports: the standard operational updates that Jennifer expected, and the real intelligence that William actually needed. The weekly intelligence reports were where I documented everything that mattered: which managers were taking credit for subordinates' work, which departments were exceeding targets, and which were hiding problems, which employees were flight risks, and which were being underutilized, which initiatives were genuinely innovative, and which were recycled ideas dressed up in new packaging. Over the years, these reports had helped William make decisions that saved Sterling Dynamics millions of dollars and prevented several potential disasters. The hostile takeover attempt from Westfield Industries 3 years ago. I'd identified their recruiting efforts months before they made their formal offer, giving William time to implement retention bonuses for key personnel. The product recall that could have cost us $50 million. I'd flagged the quality control issues 6 months before they became critical, allowing us to fix the problems quietly, but the most valuable intelligence I provided was about Marcus himself. From my unique vantage point, I could see every aspect of his professional behavior without the filter of hierarchy or politics. I watched him in meetings where he thought no one important was paying attention. I observed how he treated subordinates when he believed no executives were watching. I documented his pattern of intellectual theft with forensic precision. For 7 years, I'd been building a comprehensive file on my own husband. The file contained records of every idea Marcus had stolen, complete with timestamps and source documentation. Screenshots of original presentations that had been mysteriously revised after Marcus saw them. Email threads where he'd taken credit for solutions proposed by team members. Performance reviews where he'd inflated his contributions while minimizing others' roles. I'd documented his expense account abuses long before the Cabo trip. The pattern had started small: lunch meetings that were actually personal appointments, mileage reimbursements for trips that included personal stops. But as Marcus grew more confident in his position, the violations became bolder. Weekend strategy sessions at luxury resorts. Client entertainment that involved no actual clients. Most damning of all, I'd tracked how Marcus's success was built on a foundation of other people's work. The vendor optimization strategy that had earned him his promotion to senior manager, originally proposed by Sandra Chen in procurement, who'd left the company when her ideas were repeatedly ignored. The employee retention program that had gotten him featured in the company newsletter, developed by our HR team and presented to Marcus as a briefing, which he'd then pitched to executives as his own insight. What Marcus never realized was that his wife wasn't just documenting his crimes, she was actively protecting the people he was victimizing. When Sandra Chen left Sterling Dynamics, she found a position at one of our partner companies within 2 weeks, with a 20% salary increase and a recommendation letter that mysteriously appeared in her personnel file. The HR team members whose retention program Marcus had stolen received anonymous bonuses and recognition that appeared to come from budget surplus allocations. Through my position, I could ensure that talented people weren't lost to Marcus's plagiarism, even when I couldn't stop the plagiarism itself. I was playing a long game, building loyalty and gathering evidence while Marcus dug his own grave deeper with every stolen idea. The arrangement required extraordinary discipline. There were countless moments when I wanted to expose Marcus immediately, when I watched him humiliate employees who'd actually done the work he was claiming, when I saw him dismiss innovative ideas from people he considered beneath him, when I heard him complain at home about mediocre colleagues who were actually far more talented than he was. But William and I had agreed from the beginning that my position would be most valuable if it remained undetected for years rather than months. Real organizational intelligence required long-term observation. Corporate problems needed time to reveal their full scope, and Marcus needed enough rope to hang himself completely. The hardest part wasn't maintaining my cover at work, it was maintaining it at home. Every night, I came home to a man who had no idea he was married to his most dangerous adversary. Marcus would tell me about his successes, his insights, his brilliant strategies, and I would smile and congratulate him while mentally adding each lie to his growing file. He'd complain about difficult colleagues who didn't appreciate his leadership, never realizing he was talking to someone who documented every instance of his toxic behavior. He'd dismiss other employees as unambitious or lacking vision, not knowing that I'd personally recommended several of them for positions at better companies. The psychological strain was enormous, but it was also strangely liberating. Marcus thought he was married to a woman who admired his success and supported his ambitions. In reality, he was married to someone who saw him more clearly than anyone else in his life, and who was systematically building the case for his destruction. As I sat in my office that Monday morning, reviewing the evidence I'd spent 7 years collecting, I realized that Marcus had finally given me the perfect opportunity to reveal who I really was. The vacation photos from Natasha weren't just evidence of adultery, they were the final piece of a puzzle that would destroy everything Marcus had built on lies. For 7 years, I'd been the ghost in Sterling Dynamics' machine, invisible but omnipresent. In a few hours, Marcus and Natasha would discover that the woman they'd tried to eliminate was actually the most powerful person in the building. The student was about to become the teacher, and the lesson was going to be devastating. The 3 months leading up to that fateful Monday morning had been a masterclass in watching someone destroy themselves while believing they were winning. Marcus had grown increasingly reckless, drunk on his own perceived power, and the intoxicating validation of his affair with Natasha. It started with small changes that only someone living with him would notice. Marcus began coming home later, often smelling of expensive perfume that definitely wasn't mine. His phone, once casually left on kitchen counters and nightstands, became a jealously guarded possession that never left his sight. He started working out again, buying new clothes, even got his hair styled at a salon that charged more than I used to spend on groceries. "I need to start looking more executive," he explained when I commented on his suddenly expensive tastes. "Image matters at my level." William Sterling himself mentioned that leaders need to project success. What Marcus didn't know was that William Sterling had never said any such thing. I would have known. I attended more of William's executive briefings than Marcus did, though Marcus never saw me there. My regional operations coordinator role required me to take notes and compile reports from senior leadership meetings, making me practically invisible to the executives who assumed I was just administrative support. From my vantage point in those meetings, I watched Marcus's behavior shift dramatically. He'd always been ambitious, but now he was becoming openly dismissive of colleagues he considered beneath him. During one particularly revealing strategy session, Marcus interrupted Jennifer Walsh, his nominal superior and my official boss, 3 times to clarify points she was making. "What Jennifer is trying to say," Marcus had said with condescending patience, "is that we need to streamline our operational oversight. But the real opportunity here is to completely reimagine how we approach interdepartmental coordination." Jennifer's face had flushed with embarrassment and anger, but she'd said nothing. She was 6 months from retirement and unwilling to engage in office politics. Marcus took her silence as validation of his superior insight. From my seat in the back corner, taking what everyone assumed were routine meeting notes, I documented every instance of Marcus's growing arrogance. The way he dismissed ideas from colleagues until Natasha whispered something in his ear, then suddenly found merit in the same concepts. How he volunteered for high-visibility projects, but delegated all actual work to subordinates. The increasing frequency with which he name-dropped senior executives who'd supposedly praised his contributions. But it was Marcus's treatment of Natasha that revealed the true toxicity of their dynamic. What I initially assumed was a simple affair proved to be something far more calculating. Natasha wasn't just Marcus's mistress, she was his enabler, his intelligence gatherer, and his strategic partner in professional manipulation. I first realized the scope of their collaboration during a department restructuring meeting in February. Marcus presented what he called a comprehensive analysis of operational redundancies, a detailed report identifying which positions could be eliminated to improve efficiency. The analysis was thorough, well-researched, and would have been impressive if Marcus had actually written it. But I recognized the formatting, the analytical framework, even specific phrases from reports I'd submitted to William Sterling over the past year. Someone had taken my confidential intelligence assessments and repackaged them as Marcus's strategic insights. That someone could only be Natasha. As Marcus's executive assistant, Natasha had access to his computer, his calendar, his email accounts. She could see which meetings he attended, which reports he received, which executives he interacted with. But she shouldn't have had access to my direct communications with William Sterling, unless she'd found a way to intercept them. Over the following weeks, I began testing my suspicions. I started including subtle markers in my reports to William, specific phrases, unusual word choices, distinctive analytical approaches. Within days, those same markers appeared in Marcus's presentations and strategy documents. They were stealing my work and using it to build Marcus's reputation as a strategic visionary. The irony was devastating. For 7 years, I'd been documenting Marcus's pattern of intellectual theft. Now he was stealing from me directly, using my own intelligence reports to justify eliminating the very position I appeared to hold. But the most dangerous escalation came in March, when Marcus began targeting specific employees for termination. Not randomly, but strategically. People who'd been mentioned in my reports as particularly valuable or loyal to the company's actual values rather than its political games. Sandra Chen in procurement was the first to go. Her position was being restructured, Marcus announced, despite the fact that Sandra had just negotiated a vendor contract that would save Sterling Dynamics $3 million over 2 years. Her crime? She'd privately complained to colleagues about Marcus taking credit for optimization strategies she'd developed. Then it was Robert Kim from engineering, whose innovative safety protocols had earned genuine praise from William Sterling. Marcus managed his termination by claiming Robert was resistant to new methodologies and unable to adapt to evolving leadership expectations. One by one, Marcus was eliminating people who posed threats to his manufactured reputation. And he was using my intelligence I'd gathered to protect these exact employees, to identify and destroy them. The pattern became clear. Marcus and Natasha had turned my reporting system against itself. They were reading my assessments of company personnel and using that information to eliminate anyone who might expose Marcus's incompetence or challenge his authority. But they'd made one crucial error in their interpretation of my reports. They assumed that my praise for certain employees indicated personal loyalty to me, when in fact it indicated loyalty to the company's actual interests. They thought they were eliminating my allies, when they were actually destroying Sterling Dynamics' most valuable human resources. By late April, their confidence had reached dangerous levels. Marcus started openly discussing his vision for organizational restructuring with anyone who would listen. He spoke about eliminating dead weight, rewarding real contributors, and bringing fresh perspectives to ossified departments. At home, he became increasingly dismissive of what he saw as my own professional limitations. "The problem with people like you, Claire," he said, during one particularly brutal dinner conversation, is that you're comfortable with mediocrity. You've found your level, and you're content to stay there. But some of us are meant for bigger things. He had no idea he was talking to the person who'd been systematically documenting his every professional failure for 7 years. The final escalation came in early May, when Marcus submitted a formal request to restructure the Regional Operations Division, my division. His proposal called for eliminating my position entirely and redistributing my responsibilities among 3 junior consultants he'd personally selected. Regional Operations Coordinator is really an outdated role, he'd written in his proposal. In today's dynamic business environment, we need more agile, project-based approaches to operational oversight. The current structure creates unnecessary bureaucracy and slows decision-making processes. William Sterling forwarded me the proposal with a simple note, "Thoughts?" My response was equally brief, "The trap is set. Let them spring it." Marcus and Natasha had finally overreached. They weren't just planning to fire me, they were planning to dismantle the entire intelligence operation that had been protecting Sterling Dynamics for 7 years. They thought they were eliminating a mid-level coordinator who'd grown too comfortable in her position. They were actually attempting to destroy the company's most valuable strategic asset. And they had no idea that the woman they were targeting had been waiting 7 years for exactly this moment. Looking back now, I realize that Marcus and Natasha's decision to make my termination a public spectacle was the final stroke of arrogance that sealed their fate. They could have handled it quietly, a simple meeting, a standard severance package, a graceful exit that would have allowed them to maintain their illusion of professionalism. Instead, they chose humiliation as their weapon. The boardroom they'd selected for my termination wasn't the small conference room typically used for personnel matters. It was the executive boardroom on the 32nd floor, the same room where William Sterling held quarterly presentations for major investors, where merger announcements were made, where the company's most important decisions were documented for posterity. They'd invited witnesses, not just the necessary HR representative, but department heads who had no business being involved in a coordinator's termination. David Chen from marketing, whom Marcus considered an ally, Sarah Morrison from finance, who'd always been civil but distant, even Jennifer Walsh, my supposed supervisor, who looked increasingly uncomfortable as the meeting's true purpose became clear. We wanted to ensure transparency in our restructuring decisions, Natasha had explained when I arrived, her voice dripping with false professionalism. It's important that leadership understands the strategic thinking behind organizational changes. What she really meant was that they wanted an audience for my humiliation. They wanted witnesses to watch Marcus demonstrate his power, to see the wife who'd supposedly been coasting on her marriage finally get what she deserved. Marcus had prepared a presentation, actual slides, complete with charts and bullet points, outlining why my position was redundant in the current operational framework. He'd spent hours crafting what amounted to a professional assassination, dressed up in corporate speak and business school terminology. Regional coordination roles made sense in Sterling Dynamics' earlier phase, Marcus explained to the assembled executives, advancing to a slide titled Operational Efficiency Through Strategic Restructuring. But as we've evolved into a more agile project-based organization, these administrative positions create bottlenecks rather than solutions. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, watching him deliver what he clearly believed was a masterpiece of strategic analysis. The irony was suffocating. Marcus was using frameworks I'd developed, insights I'd provided in my intelligence reports, to justify eliminating the position that had generated those very insights. Claire has been a dedicated employee, he continued, his tone suggesting this was a generous concession. But dedication without strategic value isn't enough in today's competitive environment. We need to be ruthless about eliminating positions that don't directly contribute to revenue generation or operational excellence. Natasha nodded approvingly from her position beside him, occasionally handing him documents or advancing slides with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd rehearsed this performance. She'd dressed for the occasion, a severe black suit that projected authority, her hair pulled back in a style that screamed executive decision-maker. The engagement ring caught the light every time she moved her hands, a deliberate reminder of her new status in Marcus's life. The financial analysis is particularly compelling, Marcus said, advancing to a slide that broke down my salary, benefits, and associated overhead costs. By eliminating this position and redistributing responsibilities to existing team members, we can achieve immediate cost savings of approximately $180,000 annually, while actually improving operational efficiency through more direct reporting relationships. It was a masterful presentation in its way, thorough, well-reasoned, and completely convincing if you didn't know the truth about who was actually responsible for Sterling Dynamics' operational efficiency. Marcus had taken 7 years of my work and used it to justify my own termination. The assembled executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. David Chen kept glancing at his phone, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. Sarah Morrison took notes obsessively, perhaps sensing that she was witnessing something that would require careful documentation later. Jennifer Walsh looked increasingly pale, realizing that her own authority was being undermined by Marcus's obvious assumption of control over her department. Of course, we want to handle this transition with appropriate sensitivity, Natasha interjected smoothly. Claire will receive a generous severance package, 6 months' salary, continued benefits, and excellent references. We're not heartless, we simply need to make decisions based on business reality rather than personal relationships. The phrase personal relationships hung in the air like an accusation. Everyone in the room understood the implication that I'd been protected by my marriage to Marcus, that my position had been charity rather than merit, that this termination was long overdue justice rather than corporate betrayal. Marcus leaned back in his chair with visible satisfaction. Are there any questions about the strategic rationale behind this decision? The silence that followed was deafening. None of the assembled executives were willing to challenge what appeared to be a well-researched, thoroughly justified business decision. They were witnessing what they believed was Marcus Rivera, finally demonstrating the tough leadership decisions that senior management required. What they were actually witnessing was the most spectacular display of corporate hubris in Sterling Dynamics history. I do have one question, I said quietly, speaking for the first time since the presentation began. Has this restructuring decision been approved by the appropriate senior leadership? Marcus's confident expression flickered slightly. As department head overseeing strategic operations, I have the authority to make staffing decisions that align with our operational objectives. I see, I replied, pulling out my phone. And you're confident that this decision won't require any additional approvals or consultations? Absolutely, Natasha said quickly, perhaps sensing some subtle shift in the room's dynamics. Marcus has done his due diligence. All necessary protocols have been followed. I nodded slowly, then began typing on my phone. The soft clicking of my fingers against the screen seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly tense boardroom. What are you doing? Marcus asked, his voice carrying the first hint of uncertainty I'd heard all morning. Oh, just sending a quick message, I replied without looking up. You know how it is, keeping people informed about transitions. My phone buzzed almost immediately with a response. Then again, and again. Within 30 seconds it was vibrating continuously with incoming messages and calls. David Chen's phone buzzed next, then Sarah Morrison's, then Jennifer Walsh's. The executives began checking their devices with growing confusion, their composed expressions shifting to concern as they read whatever messages were appearing on their screens. I don't understand, Jennifer whispered, staring at her phone. Why is security asking all department heads to remain in the building? There must be some mistake. Marcus's phone rang, the sound cutting through the boardroom's growing tension like a knife. The name on the screen made him go visibly pale. William Sterling, CEO. Aren't you going to answer that? I asked, my voice perfectly calm. With trembling fingers, Marcus accepted the call. Mr. Sterling, good morning. Even from across the table, everyone could hear William's voice crisp and furious. Rivera, what the hell do you think you're doing, firing my chief operating officer without authorization? The words hit the room like a physical blow. David Chen actually dropped his phone. Sarah Morrison's pen clattered onto the table. Jennifer Walsh gripped the edge of her chair as if she might fall over. Marcus stared at me with the expression of someone who just realized they'd been standing on the edge of a cliff all along. Chief Operating Officer, Natasha whispered, her face draining of all color. I stood up slowly, smoothing my navy blazer. the same unremarkable blazer I'd worn to hundreds of meetings where everyone had dismissed me as just another mid-level employee. "Check the company directory," I said quietly. "All of you, you'll find it quite illuminating. To understand how I became the woman who could orchestrate such a perfect destruction, you need to know about the moment that changed everything. Not just my marriage or my career, but my entire understanding of power and how it really works in corporate America." It was September 15, 2018. I remember the date exactly because it was the day my grandmother died, and it was also the day I first realized that my husband was not the man I thought I'd married. I was sitting in Mercy General Hospital in Portland, holding my grandmother's hand as she slipped away peacefully in her sleep. Dorothy Rivera had been my hero, a woman who'd built a small but successful catering business from nothing in the 1960s, who'd raised 4 children while running a company, who'd taught me that true strength comes from seeing clearly and acting decisively. "Promise me something, Claire," she'd whispered during one of our last conversations. "Never let anyone make you smaller than you are. The world will try. Men especially will try. But you're stronger and smarter than most of them. Don't you ever forget that." I'd promised, not knowing how prophetic her words would prove to be. Marcus had flown down for the funeral, playing the role of the supportive husband perfectly. He held my hand during the service, spoke beautifully about my grandmother's influence on our family, and charmed my relatives with stories about his success at Sterling Dynamics. To everyone watching, we were the perfect couple, successful, ambitious, deeply in love. But on our last night in Portland, as I was packing my grandmother's belongings, I discovered something that would shatter that illusion forever. I was going through her desk, looking for important documents, when I found a folder labeled Claire's Future. Inside were newspaper clippings about Sterling Dynamics, annual reports, even printouts of articles about the company's strategic initiatives. My grandmother had been following my husband's career more closely than I'd realized. But it was the handwritten notes in the margins that stopped me cold. "This vendor optimization strategy is identical to what Claire described at Christmas dinner," she'd written beside one article about Marcus's celebrated cost reduction initiative. She said she'd been working on something similar for her consulting clients. "Employee retention program sounds exactly like Claire's MBA thesis project," was scrawled next to another story about Marcus's innovative HR policies. Page after page, my grandmother had been connecting dots that I'd been too trusting to see. She'd recognized that Marcus's sudden strategic brilliance coincided suspiciously with our dinner conversations, with my work stories, with the business challenges I'd discussed at family gatherings. Dorothy Rivera had figured out that my husband was stealing my ideas long before I had. But the most devastating discovery was a letter she'd started writing but never finished. It was dated just 2 weeks before her death, addressed to me. "My dearest Claire," it began, "I've been watching your marriage with growing concern. Marcus is charming and ambitious, but I don't think he sees you clearly. He sees you as a reflection of his own success, not as the brilliant woman you are in your own right. I'm worried that you're becoming smaller in his shadow, and that's not the woman I raised you to be." The letter went on to detail observations my grandmother had made during family visits, how Marcus interrupted me, how he dismissed my professional opinions, how he spoke about my career as if it was a hobby rather than a calling. She'd seen our dynamic more clearly than I had, probably because she'd experienced something similar with my grandfather in the early years of their marriage. "The difference," she'd written, "is that your grandfather learned to respect my mind. I'm not sure Marcus ever will. But you have options, Claire. You're stronger than you know, smarter than he gives you credit for, and more capable than he'll ever understand. Don't let his limitations become yours." I sat on my grandmother's bedroom floor, reading her unfinished letter by lamplight, feeling something fundamental shift inside me. It wasn't just grief, it was recognition. She'd seen what I'd been too close to see, that my marriage had become a performance where I played the supporting role in Marcus's success story. When I returned to Seattle, I began paying attention differently, not just to what Marcus said, but to how he said it. Not just to his stories about work, but to the timing of his insights. Not just to his treatment of me, but to his treatment of others. The pattern became impossible to ignore once I started looking for it. Marcus's presentation about supply chain optimization, delivered just 3 days after I'd explained those exact concepts to him over dinner. His innovative approach to employee development, which bore a striking resemblance to a Harvard Business Review article I'd shared with him the previous month. His strategic vision for operational efficiency, which incorporated frameworks I'd developed during my MBA program, and discussed during our long conversations about business theory. But it wasn't just intellectual theft, it was something more insidious. Marcus had convinced himself that these were his ideas, that our conversations were simply him thinking out loud, rather than him absorbing my insights. He'd rewritten our relationship's history in his mind, casting himself as the brilliant strategist and me as the supportive wife who occasionally offered useful feedback. The revelation should have destroyed me. Instead, it liberated me. For the first time in our marriage, I saw Marcus clearly, not as the ambitious leader I'd fallen in love with, but as a man whose success was built on taking credit for other people's work. And more importantly, I saw myself clearly, not as the supportive spouse content to live in his shadow, but as someone whose ideas were valuable enough to steal. That's when I made the decision that would define the next 7 years of my life. If Marcus could succeed by appropriating insights and strategies from others, then I could succeed by appropriating information from him. If he could use our personal relationship to advance his professional goals, then I could use our professional overlap to advance mine. But I wouldn't be sloppy about it. I wouldn't be obvious. I would be so thorough, so careful, so strategic, that by the time Marcus realized what was happening, it would be far too late for him to stop it. I would become the wife he thought he wanted, supportive, unambitious content with my modest role. And while he basked in that illusion, I would be gathering the intelligence that would eventually destroy him. The plan began to take shape during the sleepless nights following my grandmother's funeral. I would use my position as Marcus's wife to gain insights into Sterling Dynamics operations. I would leverage my consulting background to identify inefficiencies and opportunities. And I would find a way to turn that knowledge into real power. It took 6 months of careful planning, but eventually I arranged that fateful meeting with William Sterling. I presented my proposal not as revenge against a cheating husband, but as a strategic opportunity for corporate intelligence. I positioned myself not as a wronged wife, but as a skilled analyst who could provide unique insights into his organization. William accepted my proposal because it made business sense, but I accepted his offer because it made personal sense. For 7 years I would have a front row seat to Marcus's professional destruction, and I would be the one orchestrating it. My grandmother had been right, I was stronger and smarter than Marcus would ever understand. The question was whether I was patient enough to let him destroy himself completely before I revealed who I really was. As it turned out, I was. What Marcus and Natasha never understood, what they couldn't have understood, was that my arrangement with William Sterling wasn't just about intelligence gathering. It was about building an impenetrable fortress of legal and professional protections that would make their eventual downfall not just inevitable, but absolutely devastating. The contract I'd signed with Sterling Dynamics 7 years earlier wasn't the standard employment agreement that Natasha had probably glanced at when she was researching my termination paperwork. It was a document crafted by some of the most expensive corporate attorneys in Seattle, designed specifically to protect someone in my unique position. Melissa Parker, my cousin and one of the city's most ruthless corporate lawyers, had spent weeks perfecting the language after I'd explained my unusual situation. "Claire," she'd said, during one of our late-night strategy sessions, "what you're proposing isn't just unconventional, it's potentially explosive. If this ever comes to light, you need to be protected from every possible angle." The brilliance was in the details. Officially, I was Regional Operations Coordinator, reporting to Jennifer Walsh in the Operations Department. That was the title on my business cards, my email signature, my office nameplate. It was the position that appeared in the company directory, the role that HR used for my benefits administration, the job description that my supposed colleagues understood. But buried in the company's executive compensation records, accessible only to William Sterling and the board of directors, was my real title, Chief Operating Officer, Strategic Intelligence Division. a position that technically didn't exist in Sterling Dynamics' public organizational chart, but which carried all the legal protections and authorities of a C-suite executive. The compensation structure was equally sophisticated. My visible salary was that of a mid-level coordinator, respectable but unremarkable. But hidden within various executive bonus pools, consulting fees, and special project allocations was compensation that reflected my actual role. The money was distributed through multiple accounts and payment systems, making it nearly impossible to trace unless you knew exactly what to look for. More importantly, my termination clause was ironclad in ways that would have shocked Marcus if he'd ever bothered to investigate. According to the public records, firing Regional Operations Coordinator Claire Rivera required nothing more than standard HR approval and appropriate notice. But terminating Chief Operating Officer Claire Rivera required unanimous board approval, 6 months advance notice, and cause that could withstand legal scrutiny. The clause that Melissa had insisted on, the one that would prove most devastating to Marcus and Natasha, was buried in subsection 12. Point 7 of my executive agreement. Any attempt to terminate the COO position without proper authorization automatically triggers a comprehensive audit of all personnel decisions made by the acting management team, with particular focus on conflicts of interest, expense account violations, and unauthorized appropriation of company resources. In other words, the moment Marcus signed those termination papers, he'd unknowingly activated a legal time bomb that would detonate his entire career. But the protection mechanisms went far beyond contracts and legal language. Over 7 years, I'd been building a network of allies and evidence sources throughout Sterling Dynamics that would have impressed any intelligence professional. Take Patricia, William Sterling's executive assistant. To most employees, she was just another administrative professional, efficient, discreet, utterly unremarkable. But Patricia had been with Sterling Dynamics for 15 years, and she developed an encyclopedic knowledge of the company's operations. More importantly, she'd learned to identify which executives were genuine leaders and which were merely skilled politicians. Patricia had been watching Marcus's rise with the same skepticism I'd been documenting. When I'd quietly suggested that she might want to keep copies of certain documents for organizational continuity purposes, she'd understood immediately. For 3 years, Patricia had been maintaining parallel files of Marcus's expense reports, meeting schedules, and email correspondence. Then there was Robert Kim in engineering, one of the talented employees Marcus had targeted for elimination. Robert didn't know about my real role, but he'd approached me months earlier with concerns about safety protocols being compromised by budget cuts. I'd encouraged him to document everything, to create detailed records of the standards being relaxed and the potential consequences. When Marcus terminated Robert for being resistant to new methodologies, Robert had taken those files with him, and when I'd quietly reached out through intermediaries to offer Robert a position at one of Sterling Dynamics' partner companies, he'd been very willing to share his documentation with the right people. Sarah Morrison in finance was another crucial ally, though she didn't realize it. Sarah was naturally meticulous, the kind of person who noticed when expense categories didn't align with stated business purposes. Over the years, I'd made a point of asking Sarah seemingly innocent questions about budget allocations and spending patterns. "I'm trying to understand our operational costs better," I'd explain when requesting detailed expense breakdowns. William Sterling asked me to prepare a comprehensive report on departmental efficiency. Sarah had been happy to provide the information, never realizing that she was helping me build a forensic accounting case against my own husband. The most sophisticated protection mechanism, though, was the communication system William and I had established. Every week I submitted my intelligence reports through an encrypted channel that created automatic backups in multiple secure servers. The system was designed to ensure that even if my access was compromised, years of documentation would remain intact. Each report was time-stamped, encrypted, and linked to corroborating evidence from multiple sources. If anyone ever questioned the authenticity of my intelligence, or suggested that I'd fabricated evidence against Marcus, we had an unbreakable chain of documentation spanning 7 years. But perhaps the most elegant protection was psychological rather than legal. Marcus's own arrogance had become his greatest vulnerability. He was so convinced of his superiority, so certain that his wife was beneath his notice professionally, that he'd never bothered to investigate my actual role within the company. For 7 years, he'd been living with and confiding in the person who posed the greatest threat to his career, and he'd never suspected a thing. Every dinner conversation where he'd complained about incompetent colleagues, every late-night phone call where he'd discussed strategy with Natasha, every moment of private triumph where he'd celebrated appropriate someone else's work. I'd been there, listening, documenting, building the case for his destruction. The morning of my termination, as I'd sat in my office preparing for the confrontation that would end Marcus's career, I'd reviewed the protection mechanisms one final time. The contracts were solid, the evidence was overwhelming, the allies were positioned, the legal safeguards were triggered. Marcus and Natasha thought they were firing a mid-level coordinator who'd grown too comfortable in her position. They were actually attempting to destroy someone who'd spent 7 years building the most comprehensive corporate intelligence operation in Sterling Dynamics history. They'd brought knives to a gunfight, and they didn't even know the battle had already begun. The 30 minutes that followed William Sterling's explosive phone call were a masterclass in watching arrogance crumble into panic. As Marcus fumbled with his phone, trying to end the call that had just destroyed his world, I could see him mentally scrambling to understand how his carefully orchestrated termination had become his own professional execution. "This has to be some kind of mistake," Marcus stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Claire, tell them this is a mistake. You're regional operations coordinator. You've been regional operations coordinator for 5 years." I remained seated, perfectly calm, watching as the other executives frantically pulled out their phones to access the company directory. The clicking of keyboards and swiping of screens filled the boardroom as they searched for answers that would shatter everything they thought they knew about Sterling Dynamics hierarchy. David Chen from marketing was the first to find it. His face went white as he stared at his screen. "This can't be right," he muttered. "The directory shows Claire as Chief Operating Officer, Strategic Intelligence Division, reporting directly to William Sterling." Sarah Morrison's hands were shaking as she scrolled through the executive compensation record she'd just accessed. The salary structure, oh my God. The salary structure shows she's been receiving executive-level compensation for 7 years. How did I miss this in the budget reports? Jennifer Walsh, my supposed supervisor, looked like she might faint.
"I don't understand."
"I've been submitting your performance reviews. I approved your vacation requests. I thought I was your boss."
"You were,"
I said gently. "At least that's what your records showed." William and I decided it was important to maintain operational security. "You've done nothing wrong, Jennifer. You've been an excellent cover." The word cover hit the room like a physical blow. The executives who'd just witnessed what they believed was my professional humiliation were beginning to realize they'd actually witnessed the unmasking of the most powerful person they'd never known existed. Marcus's phone rang again. This time he didn't hesitate to answer, his desperation evident in how quickly he grabbed for it. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice cracking. "There's clearly been some confusion here. Claire is my wife. She's regional operations coordinator. She's been—" "Shut up," William's voice cut through the boardroom like a blade. Even through the phone speaker, his fury was palpable. "Do not speak. Do not explain. Do not move from that room. Security is on their way up, and you're going to remain exactly where you are until they arrive." "But sir, I can explain." "There is nothing to explain, Rivera. For 7 years your wife has been providing me with detailed intelligence about this company's operations. For 7 years she's been documenting every decision, every policy change, every personnel move made by middle management. Do you know what those reports show about your performance?" Marcus's face had gone ashen. Beside him, Natasha gripped the edge of the conference table so tightly her knuckles were white. "They show," William continued, his voice deadly calm, "that you're a fraud. They show systematic intellectual theft, expense account violations, and the deliberate sabotage of employees who pose threats to your manufactured reputation. They show that my chief operating officer has been protecting this company from your incompetence for years while you took credit for her work." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear Marcus's shallow breathing, could see Natasha's chest rising and falling rapidly as panic set in. 7 years, Rivera. 7 years of documented evidence. Did you really think you could fire the person who's been building the case against you since the day she was hired? That's when the first security guards appeared at the boardroom door, not the usual corporate security that escorted terminated employees to their cars, but serious men in dark suits who moved with the efficiency of professionals accustomed to handling sensitive situations. "Mr. Sterling," the lead security officer said, speaking to my phone since William was still on the line. "Building is secured. Legal team is standing by. How do you want to proceed? Escort Mr. Rivera and Miss Chen to conference room B on the 20th floor." William's voice came through clearly. "They're to remain there until legal arrives. No phone calls, no communication with anyone outside that room. Their access cards have been deactivated, their computers locked, their expense accounts frozen." Marcus started to protest, but the security officer's raised hand silenced him immediately. "Ma'am," the officer said, turning to me with obvious respect, "Mr. Sterling requests that you remain here with the department heads. He's on his way up to address the situation personally." As Marcus and Natasha were escorted from the room, Natasha looking back over her shoulder with an expression of pure terror, the remaining executives sat in stunned silence. Jennifer Walsh was the first to speak. "How long have you really been?" She trailed off, unable to finish the question. 7 years, I replied. "Since 2 weeks after Marcus and I moved to Seattle. William Sterling recruited me personally after I identified significant vulnerabilities in the company's middle management structure." David Chen shook his head slowly. "The strategic initiatives that Marcus has been championing, the cost-saving measures, the operational improvements, all based on intelligence reports I've been submitting weekly for the past 7 years, I confirmed. Marcus was using my assessments to identify valuable ideas he could appropriate and talented employees he could eliminate." Sarah Morrison was frantically scrolling through financial records on her tablet. "The budget allocations I've been processing, some of these consulting fees, the special project funds, they were going to you, weren't they?" "Executive compensation can be structured in many ways," I said diplomatically. "The important thing is that Sterling Dynamics has been protected from the kind of strategic vulnerabilities that could have destroyed the company." The elevator chimed, and through the glass walls of the boardroom, we could see William Sterling approaching with a team of attorneys and what appeared to be federal investigators. His expression was grim, purposeful, and absolutely focused. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, standing as William entered the room, "I think it's time you met your actual chief operating officer." William Sterling commanded attention the moment he walked into the room. At 62, he'd built Sterling Dynamics from a small engineering firm into a multi-billion-dollar corporation through a combination of strategic brilliance and an almost supernatural ability to identify talent. Right now, he looked like a man who'd just discovered that one of his most valuable assets had been under attack for years. "First," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives, "I want to apologize to all of you for the deception that's been necessary. The Strategic Intelligence Division has been one of Sterling Dynamics' most closely guarded secrets, and Claire's role within it has been classified at the highest levels." He gestured toward me. "For 7 years, Chief Operating Officer Claire Rivera has been providing this company with intelligence that has saved us millions of dollars, prevented hostile takeovers, and identified operational inefficiencies before they became critical problems. Her work has been exemplary, and her loyalty to this organization has been absolute." The department heads stared at me with new understanding. I wasn't the mid-level coordinator they'd worked alongside for years. I was the executive who'd been quietly shaping their professional fates without them ever knowing it. "What you witnessed this morning," William continued, "was an attempted corporate coup by individuals who had no idea they were targeting the person responsible for protecting this company's strategic interests. That coup has failed, and there will be consequences." The transformation in the boardroom's atmosphere was immediate and profound. Minutes earlier, I'd been sitting in a chair as a condemned employee, watching Marcus deliver what he'd believed was my professional death sentence. Now, department heads who'd never given me a second thought were standing when I entered the room, their expressions a mixture of shock, respect, and barely concealed fear. William Sterling gestured toward the head of the conference table, the position Marcus had occupied just 30 minutes earlier when he'd been orchestrating my humiliation. "Claire, if you would." I moved to the chair that Marcus had vacated, settling into the position that had always been mine by right but never by appearance. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The woman they'd watched being terminated was now sitting in the seat of ultimate authority. Before we address the immediate crisis, William continued, I want each of you to understand exactly who you've been working alongside for the past 7 years. He activated the wall display, and my actual personnel file appeared, not the sanitized coordinator profile that HR maintained, but the comprehensive record of my role as Chief Operating Officer. Performance reviews that praised strategic brilliance, compensation records that revealed my true value to the organization, commendations for initiatives that had saved Sterling Dynamics millions of dollars. Jennifer Walsh stared at the screen in growing horror. The operational efficiency reports I thought I was supervising, they were really coming from you. Every one, I confirmed. The cost reduction strategies that saved us $12 million last year, the vendor optimization program that improved our profit margins by 18%, the employee retention initiatives that reduced turnover to industry-leading levels. I developed all of them while maintaining my coordinator cover. David Chen from marketing was frantically scrolling through his tablet. The strategic market analysis that guided our Q3 campaign, the one Marcus presented to the board. Based on intelligence I provided in my weekly reports to William, I said. Marcus had been intercepting and repackaging my assessments for months. He just didn't realize that William and I were comparing notes. The legal team that had entered with William was setting up equipment at the far end of the conference table, laptops, recording devices, stacks of documents that represented 7 years of carefully accumulated evidence. The lead attorney, a severe woman named Catherine Ross, began laying out files with the methodical precision of someone preparing for war. Miss Rivera, Catherine said, we're ready to begin the formal documentation process. The federal investigators will want to review your intelligence reports chronologically, starting with the earliest evidence of fraudulent expense claims. Sarah Morrison's face went pale. Federal investigators, William's expression was grim. When corporate fraud reaches the levels we've documented, it becomes a matter for federal authorities. Marcus Rivera's expense account violations alone exceed $200,000 over the past 2 years. Combined with the intellectual property theft, the fraudulent termination attempt, and the systematic sabotage of company personnel, we're looking at multiple felonies. I opened my laptop and accessed the secure server that contained 7 years of intelligence reports. The files appeared on the wall display, hundreds of documents, thousands of pages of evidence, a comprehensive record of every crime Marcus had committed against Sterling Dynamics and its employees. This is the earliest documentation of Marcus's expense fraud, I said, highlighting a report from 2019, a $3,500 charge for client entertainment that was actually a romantic weekend with his then-girlfriend in Victoria. I flagged it as suspicious, but HR was told it had been pre-approved by senior management. Catherine Ross made notes as I continued. The intellectual property theft began around the same time. Here's my analysis of a vendor optimization strategy, submitted 3 weeks before Marcus presented an identical proposal as his own innovation. Document after document appeared on the screen, each one another nail in Marcus's professional coffin. The department heads watched in stunned silence as years of suspicious decisions were revealed to be part of a systematic pattern of corruption. The termination of Sandra Chen, I continued, advancing to a more recent file. Marcus claimed she was underperforming, but my reports show she just negotiated our most favorable vendor contract in 5 years. He eliminated her because she'd begun questioning where his innovative procurement strategies were really coming from. Jennifer Walsh was shaking her head slowly. Robert Kim in engineering. The safety protocol specialist you said was resistant to change. Robert had documented 14 instances where Marcus's cost-cutting measures violated industry safety standards, I replied. He was terminated 3 days after submitting a formal complaint to what he thought was the appropriate channel. But it was the final series of documents that brought the full scope of Marcus's betrayal into focus. Screenshots of his email conversations with Natasha, planning my termination while conducting their affair on company time and expense accounts, financial records showing how they'd funded their romantic getaways with Sterling Dynamics corporate credit cards, evidence of their systematic campaign to destroy my reputation and eliminate employees who posed threats to Marcus's manufactured success. The Cabo trip, William said, his voice tight with anger, was paid for entirely with company funds, $18,000 charged to various expense categories, including the engagement ring Marcus bought for his mistress. The federal investigator, a quiet man named Agent Morrison, looked up from his notes. Miss Rivera, in your assessment, was this termination attempt the culmination of a long-term plan to eliminate your oversight of Mr. Rivera's activities? Absolutely, I replied. Marcus and Natasha had been planning this for months. They'd identified my position as the primary obstacle to their ability to operate without scrutiny. They just didn't realize that eliminating me would trigger the comprehensive audit that would expose everything they'd been hiding. Catherine Ross activated another display. The termination clause in Miss Rivera's executive contract was specifically designed to prevent exactly this scenario. Any unauthorized attempt to eliminate the chief operating officer automatically activates a full forensic review of all related personnel decisions. The irony was perfect and devastating. Marcus's attempt to fire me had triggered the very investigation that would destroy him. In trying to eliminate his greatest threat, he'd activated the mechanism that would expose all his crimes. William Sterling looked around the table at the assembled department heads. This is why the Strategic Intelligence Division exists. This is why we've maintained operational security around Claire's real role. Corporate fraud at this level can destroy companies, eliminate jobs, devastate communities. We've been protecting Sterling Dynamics from this threat for 7 years. Agent Morrison closed his laptop and looked directly at me. Miss Rivera, based on the evidence you've provided, will be seeking federal charges against both Mr. Rivera and Miss Chen. The scope of the fraud, combined with their use of company resources to conduct personal business, meets the threshold for multiple felonies. I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. 7 years of careful planning had led to this moment, the complete destruction of the man I'd once loved, orchestrated by the woman he'd never bothered to understand. There's one more thing, I said, opening a final file on my laptop. Marcus submitted a formal proposal last week to restructure the entire regional operations division. He wanted to eliminate my position and replace it with 3 junior consultants he'd personally selected. William's eyes narrowed. People connected to him personally, his college roommate Natasha's brother, and the son of one of his golf partners, I confirmed. He was planning to dismantle the intelligence operation that had been protecting Sterling Dynamics and replace it with a network of personal loyalists. The silence that followed was profound. Marcus hadn't just been stealing money and taking credit for others' work, he'd been preparing to gut the company's strategic defenses and install his own people in positions of trust. Gentlemen, William said to the federal agents, I think you have everything you need. The forensic audit that followed revealed the true magnitude of Marcus and Natasha's systematic destruction of Sterling Dynamics' integrity. What I'd initially assumed was simple adultery and expense fraud proved to be something far more sophisticated, a coordinated campaign to hollow out the company from within, while enriching themselves and their network of accomplices. Agent Morrison's team worked with surgical precision, following paper trails I'd been documenting for years, but had never seen assembled into a complete picture. The conference room transformed into a war room, with federal accountants, cybersecurity experts, and fraud investigators methodically dismantling 7 years of careful deception. The financial irregularities go beyond personal expense fraud, Agent Morrison announced after 6 hours of intensive review. Mr. Rivera has been systematically steering contracts toward companies owned by his personal associates, collecting what appear to be kickback payments disguised as consulting fees. Sarah Morrison, no relation to the federal agent, looked stricken as she reviewed financial records with new understanding. The Phoenix Technologies contract, she whispered. Marcus insisted we use them for our server upgrades, even though their bid was 30% higher than competitors. He said they offered strategic advantages that justified the cost. Phoenix Technologies is owned by Nathan Forsyth, I confirmed, pulling up the corporate records I'd researched months earlier. Marcus's college roommate and business school study partner. The $2.8 million contract included a project management fees of $280,000, paid directly to a consulting firm that Marcus controls through a shell company. The cyber investigation revealed even more damaging evidence. Natasha had been using her access to Marcus's computer systems to steal intellectual property on a massive scale. Employee proposals, strategic plans, innovative solutions developed by Sterling Dynamics' most talented workers, all systematically copied and sold to competitors through a network of intermediaries. Ms. Chen was running what amounts to a corporate espionage operation, the lead cybersecurity investigator reported. She copied over 15,000 files from various departments, including proprietary engineering designs, customer lists, and strategic planning documents. The data was transmitted to external servers controlled by competing firms. Jennifer Walsh was reviewing personnel files with growing horror. The employees who were terminated over the past 2 years, Sandra Chen, Robert Kim, Maria Santos from product development, they weren't underperforming. They were getting too close to exposing the theft. Every termination Marcus orchestrated was strategically motivated, I confirmed. He eliminated anyone who posed a threat to his operations, or who developed innovations he wanted to steal without attribution. Then he brought in his own people, individuals with personal loyalty to him rather than professional qualifications. The most devastating revelation came when Agent Morrison's team accessed Marcus's personal financial records. The man who'd built his reputation on strategic brilliance and operational efficiency had been bleeding Sterling Dynamics dry to fund a lifestyle that far exceeded his legitimate income. The real estate purchases, the luxury vehicles, the private club memberships, Agent Morrison listed methodically, all funded through fraudulent expense reimbursements, kickback payments, and the sale of stolen intellectual property. We're looking at approximately $1.2 million in provable theft over the past 4 years alone. But it was the discovery of Marcus's succession plan that revealed the true scope of his ambitions. Hidden in encrypted files on his personal laptop was a detailed strategy for taking complete control of Sterling Dynamics through a carefully orchestrated coup. He was planning to force William Sterling into early retirement, Catherine Ross explained, reading from the recovered documents. Create a financial crisis through strategic sabotage, then position himself as the only executive capable of saving the company. The plan included eliminating key personnel like Claire and replacing them with his own network. The timeline was chilling in its precision. Marcus had been working toward this goal for over 2 years, systematically weakening Sterling Dynamics' defenses while positioning himself as indispensable. The termination attempt against me wasn't just personal vindictiveness, it was the opening move in a campaign to seize control of the entire company. If this plan had succeeded, William Sterling said grimly, Sterling Dynamics would have been effectively stolen from its legitimate ownership and handed over to a criminal network. Agent Morrison closed his laptop and looked directly at William. Mr. Sterling, we'll be recommending federal charges on multiple counts: wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, theft of trade secrets, and violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Both Rivera and Chen are looking at potential sentences of 15 to 20 years. The woman I'd thought was simply my husband's mistress had actually been the operational commander of a sophisticated corporate crime syndicate, and the man I'd married had been planning the systematic destruction of everything William Sterling had built. 20 floors below, in Conference Room B, Marcus and Natasha were experiencing their own private hell. Through the building's security system, William and I could monitor their deteriorating situation as the reality of their predicament finally penetrated their shared delusion of invincibility. This is insane, Marcus was saying, pacing the small room like a caged animal. Claire is my wife. She's a mid-level coordinator. There has to be some mistake, some confusion in the records. Natasha sat slumped in her chair, her carefully applied makeup smeared with tears. The confident executive assistant, who'd orchestrated my humiliation just hours earlier, had been replaced by a terrified woman, finally understanding the magnitude of her crimes. The federal agents, Marcus, she whispered. They mentioned wire fraud, conspiracy charges. Do you understand what that means? We're looking at federal prison. Stop panicking, Marcus snapped, though his own voice carried an edge of hysteria. This is some kind of setup, some elaborate scheme to discredit me. Claire doesn't have the intelligence or resources to orchestrate something this sophisticated. Even now, even facing complete destruction, Marcus couldn't conceive that his wife possessed capabilities he'd never recognized. His fundamental inability to see me clearly had been his greatest weakness, and it would be his final downfall. Agent Morrison entered the room with Catherine Ross and 2 additional federal agents. The small conference room suddenly felt crowded with the weight of impending justice. Mr. Rivera, Miss Chen, Agent Morrison began formally. You're both under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, theft of trade secrets, and violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Marcus lurched to his feet. I demand to speak with my wife. This is all some misunderstanding. Claire will tell you. Miss Rivera is currently providing testimony about your criminal activities. Catherine Ross interrupted coldly. 7 years of documented evidence, Mr. Rivera. Every fraudulent expense claim, every stolen idea, every eliminated employee. Your wife has been building the case against you since the day she was hired. The blood drained from Marcus's face as the implication hit him. That's impossible. She's been supporting my career, celebrating my successes. She's been documenting your crimes. Agent Morrison corrected. Chief Operating Officer Claire Rivera has provided us with the most comprehensive corporate fraud investigation we've seen in years. Natasha's composure finally cracked completely. Chief Operating Officer, she screamed. That's impossible. I researched her position. I had access to all the personnel files. You had access to the files you were supposed to see, Catherine Ross replied. Miss Rivera's actual role was classified at the highest levels. You were stealing from and attempting to eliminate one of the most powerful executives in the company. The next hour was a systematic destruction of every lie Marcus and Natasha had told themselves. Agent Morrison read the charges in detail, each count representing years of careful planning and execution. The evidence was overwhelming, the documentation irrefutable. The Phoenix Technologies kickback scheme alone carries a potential sentence of 12 years. Agent Morrison explained. Combined with the intellectual property theft, the expense fraud, and the conspiracy charges, you're both looking at federal sentences of 15 to 20 years. Marcus's final words before being led away in handcuffs were characteristic of the man who'd never understood the woman he'd married. Claire couldn't have planned this. She's not smart enough. As they were escorted from the building, past employees, who'd once respected Marcus's authority, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and loss. The man I'd once loved had been destroyed by his own arrogance, his inability to see that the woman sharing his bed was also shaping his fate. 7 years of strategic patience had culminated in this moment of perfect justice. In the weeks that followed Marcus and Natasha's arrest, Sterling Dynamics underwent the most comprehensive transformation in its corporate history. What had begun as my personal quest for justice evolved into something far more significant, the complete reformation of a company's values and culture. My first official act as publicly acknowledged Chief Operating Officer was to address the entire company. Standing in the main auditorium, facing 800 employees, who'd known me only as a mid-level coordinator, I felt the weight of 7 years of deception finally lifting from my shoulders.
Many of you are confused about recent events, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium. You've learned that someone you barely noticed was actually responsible for many of the policies and initiatives that have shaped your work experience here. I want to explain why that deception was necessary, and what it means for our future. The audience was silent, attentive, many faces showing mixtures of shock and recognition as they processed the revelation. Sandra Chen, whom I'd quietly helped secure a position at our partner company after Marcus terminated her, sat in the front row with a knowing smile. For 7 years, I've been documenting systematic fraud, intellectual property theft, and the deliberate sabotage of talented employees. The Strategic Intelligence Division existed to protect Sterling Dynamics from internal threats that could have destroyed everything we've built together. I outlined the scope of Marcus's crimes without sensationalizing them. The stolen innovations, the fraudulent expenses, the kickback schemes, the planned corporate coup. The employees deserved to understand how close they'd come to losing everything to a criminal conspiracy. The Trevenise Igdibernis Dabanar Marcus, The Trevenise Gibberdis de Matapates. But this company's strength was never in any single executive, I continued. It was in people like Sandra Chen, who negotiated vendor contracts that saved us millions. Robert Kim, whose safety protocols protected lives. Maria Santos, whose product innovations drove our success. All people that the previous management tried to eliminate because their integrity threatened fraudulent operations. The applause that followed was spontaneous and sustained. These were employees who'd watched talented colleagues disappear, who'd seen good ideas attributed to the wrong people, who'd sensed something was wrong but couldn't identify the source. Over the following months, we implemented changes that went far beyond replacing corrupt executives. The entire organizational structure was reformed to ensure transparency and accountability. Anonymous reporting systems were established to prevent future fraud. Most importantly, we created pathways for innovation and recognition that couldn't be manipulated by office politics. Robert Kim returned as Chief Safety Officer, bringing with him safety protocols that became industry standards. Sandra Chen became our Director of Strategic Partnerships, her vendor relationship expertise saving the company additional millions. Maria Santos was promoted to head our new product innovation division. The financial recovery was remarkable. Without the drain of fraudulent expenses and kickback schemes, without the cost of constantly replacing talented employees, Sterling Dynamics' profitability increased by 23% in the first quarter, following the restructuring. But the most significant change was cultural. Employees who'd been afraid to voice innovative ideas began proposing solutions with confidence. Departments that had been protective of information began collaborating openly. The company that had been slowly poisoned by Marcus's toxic leadership began to flourish under principles of transparency and merit-based advancement. William Sterling, energized by the transformation, postponed his planned retirement. "Claire," he said, during one of our strategy meetings, "you've accomplished something I didn't think was possible. You've turned a near disaster into our greatest opportunity for growth." The legal proceedings continued for months, each revelation adding to the mountain of evidence against Marcus and Natasha. Their trial became a case study in corporate fraud, with my intelligence reports serving as the foundation for federal prosecutors' arguments. 18 months later, I stood in the same boardroom where Marcus had attempted my professional execution, reading the final verdict that would close this chapter of my life forever. The federal jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding both Marcus and Natasha guilty on all counts. Marcus received 22 years in federal prison. Natasha got 18 years. The judge, in her sentencing remarks, called their scheme one of the most comprehensive corporate fraud cases in recent memory, citing the systematic nature of their crimes and the devastating impact on innocent employees. I felt no satisfaction in their destruction, only a profound sense of closure. The woman who'd endured 7 years of strategic deception could finally emerge fully into the light. My grandmother's unfinished letter remained framed on my office wall, the real office now, the executive suite that reflected my actual role rather than the careful camouflage I'd maintained for so long. "Don't let anyone make you smaller than you are," she'd written, and I finally understood the full power of that advice. Sterling Dynamics thrived under authentic leadership. Without the drain of fraud and the toxicity of stolen credit, we became the innovative company we'd always had the potential to be. Employee satisfaction reached record highs. Revenue increased by 40% as talented people felt empowered to contribute their best work. The most profound change was personal. For the first time in over a decade, I could be completely honest about who I was and what I'd accomplished. No more hidden roles, no more strategic deceptions, no more pretending to be less than I was to protect someone else's ego. William Sterling announced his retirement on my 2nd anniversary as public COO, recommending me as his successor. The board's unanimous approval felt like the final validation of a journey that had begun with heartbreak and evolved into something far more meaningful. "You saved this company," William said during his farewell dinner. "But more importantly, you saved yourself." Sometimes late at night, in the quiet of my office, I think about the cost of the justice I'd pursued. A marriage destroyed, a life rebuilt, 7 years of careful strategy finally bearing fruit. Marcus had been right about one thing. I had been content with mediocrity, at least the version of myself I'd allowed him to see. The woman who emerged from his ashes was someone he'd never had the wisdom to recognize, stronger, more capable, and infinitely more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. My grandmother would have been proud. I'd finally stopped letting anyone make me smaller than I was, and I was exactly as large as I'd always been meant to be.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.